right, so I think we're ready to get started here. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CCA's webinar, Interpreting the Mexican Cartel's Latest Public Maneuvers. As Vice President of the Canadian Council for the Americas, it's my pleasure to be your host and to introduce the CCA to those of you who don't know us. The CCA is Canada's premier forum for discussion of the critical political and economic issues in the hemisphere. Since March, we have hosted over 20 events, including several on the COVID-19 pandemic across the region, discussing specifically the public health as well as economic impacts. And just on that, CCA President Ken Frankel will be sitting on a panel with Professor Desmond Arias, the chair of Western Hemisphere at Baruch College at City University of New York. And we'll be sharing the registration information for that event in the coming days. It'll be happening next week. Earlier this week, we actually hosted a conversation about the way forward for the Inter-American Development Bank as President Moreno steps down in a couple of months. And that was a very interesting conversation about development financing, as well as what it'll look like going forward, particularly through the COVID pandemic, as well as other things in the future. And just on that note, Ken will be joining Amanda Lang on BNN Bloomberg tomorrow to discuss specifically that issue. On another note, I'm just also pleased to mention CCA's podcast, Two Gringos with Questions, a co-production with Global Americans. The podcast is co-hosted by CCA President Ken Frankel and Chris Sabatini, Senior Fellow on Latin America at Chatham House in London. In the coming days, our latest podcast, apropos of today's event, is an interview with Bernardo Sepulveda, former Mexican foreign minister and former judge at the International Court of Justice. You can access the podcast on our website as well. It is very readily available on SoundCloud, iTunes, as well as Spotify. So we invite you to visit our website, ccacanada.com, to view past event videos, the podcast, and to also see other upcoming events as they come up. I would also just like to give a very special thank you to CCA's annual premium members, without whom we wouldn't be able to do these events online. So we're very pleased to host this discussion today on the Mexican cartel's latest public maneuvers. And we're extremely thrilled to have with us, excuse me, our three panelists. I'll start off with Vanda Felbab-Brown. She's Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy at the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at Brookings. Nathaniel Parish Flannery, author of most recent book, Searching for Modern Mexico. He's also an analyst and contributor to Forbes, Fortune, The Atlantic, and the New York Times. And finally, Eduardo Guerrero, director and partner of Lantia Consulting, as well as a columnist of El Financiero and a contributor to Nexos. We invite write questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to them. Ken?
Yeah, hi, Marta. I think we lost the reception in and out, but I think we're all back. We're fine at this point.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you. We can all hear. We're fine.
I'm not sure exactly where I got cut off, but
well, I think I can finish it for you. That was a great introduction. I think the idea is that we will be taking written questions. For those who are listening, you know well the feature on Zoom. There is a question and answer feature at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to use it liberally. It would be great if you could keep your questions to a few sentences. We sometimes get questions of 3 and 4 paragraphs long, which I admire, but it's pretty hard to get to them and read them when the time comes. And we will do our best to get to them today and integrate them as we go along. So I think with that, we can get started. Thank you, Marta.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Over to you, Ken. That was my final sentence.
This is our 21st webinar in 4 months. First time we've had a little technical difficulty. I don't think it's because of the cartels. I really don't. But anyway, to start this, Nate or Nathaniel, I want to go to you first. We're all seeing what appears to be an escalation in the activity of the cartels in Mexico, and not just an escalation in their appearances, but an audacity in the kinds of things that they are doing. Some on obviously hits, and others just apparently might be apparently for publicity purposes. I wonder if you could just run through what's gone on in the last several months so we understand the underlying factual basis for the conversation going forward. Nathaniel?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question and a great way to start the discussion about what's going on in general in Mexico right now. It seems like for the last 10 or 15 years, anybody interested in basically any topic related to Mexico also has questions about how their area of interest could be affected by violence or organized crime. And right now we definitely are seeing a number of interesting and also alarming things happening. And I think that we can sum up the overall dynamic by looking at 3 basic concepts. The most basic of which is there's more murders happening in Mexico right now. So if you look at Mexico's government figures on yearly homicides, the last 3 years have been significantly bad. Every year, 2017, 2018, and 2019 are all records for homicides. And if we can see, there's something interesting here. The total number of murders in 2018 is actually about 3 times worse than in 2006, which was the year that former President Felipe Calderón started the drug war against organized crime groups in Mexico. So we can absolutely say there is a fundamental trend going on all over Mexico of violent crime, and it's not just a sensational issue that we find a few news stories driving the narrative when there's no underlying trend to justify it. In general, violence is up in Mexico. We can say that's an absolute fact. There are certain states in Mexico that have emerged as real hotspots during the López Obrador administration. I would think Guanajuato, Michoacán, and Chihuahua stand out both for the overall level of violence and that the trend is towards increasing violence. The second overall concept, which is important for understanding the overall dynamic, is that there's a lot of scary incidents happening, and that has attracted attention, and that has kind of pushed a lot of public discussion about what's really going on here. Most recently, there was an assassination attempt against Mexico City's police chief. The visuals of that look like a video game or an action movie. We saw cartel gunmen using .50 caliber weapons standing in the back of a dump truck in the middle of one of Mexico City's wealthiest neighborhoods. That in combination with some of the visuals that we saw related to a major battle between organized crime groups and government forces in Sinaloa last year, or the recent video of the new generation cartel of Jalisco showing an array of several dozen heavily armored military-style vehicles and cartel gunmen wearing uniforms that display a level of professionalism that could easily be confused with government forces. Those incidents just appearing in the news, I think casual observers or foreign executives who aren't necessarily specialists in Mexico can see those and wonder what's going on in Mexico. Are things significantly worse right now than they were 3 years ago, than they were 10 years ago? How does the overall dynamic now compare to previous years? And I think with that, it's important to note that, as I mentioned, there were a number of incidents last year with the battle a battle related to the arrest of El Chapo's son in Sinaloa. There was a major massacre of police officers in Michoacán, which was another very scary incident, but it didn't get as much news coverage and certainly didn't get the level of coverage in the US as some of these more recent events. And even going back to 2015, the same cartel from Jalisco that is attracting all of the attention now, they did two things in 2015, which were they created what are called Narco Blockades. They set trucks and buses all on fire in one of Mexico's wealthiest and most industrialized cities in Guadalajara, basically shutting down and terrorizing the entire city for a day. And in that same year, they also shot down a police helicopter, killing several soldiers and police officers. So it would be possible to look at 2015 and say, these incidents are, very scary. There's a, trend towards upward violence. Could we have the same conversation that we're having right now in 2015? I think that's, an interesting question to ask. Which brings me to the third key concept here, which is, part of what's going on right now is our perception. And a big issue here is that foreign news outlets are paying attention. And you have TV news anchors in the US who don't usually cover Mexico, who have picked up a narrative right now that Mexico's president is failing to combat organized crime in Mexico. And in particular, there's this story that his hugs and bullets policy is an absurd miscalculation and won't be effective in in battling heavily armed cartel groups. And that's a narrative that is easy to digest and palatable for certain news networks in the US and can generate a larger debate, but is also not necessarily helpful for specialists or executives that are really trying to understand the current dynamic in Mexico. So just to start the conversation, I think we can say, overall what we're seeing in Mexico is more murders, scary incidents, and more news coverage from national news outlets in the US.
Thank you very much, Nate. So Eduardo, though, is this an escalation, or is this, as Nathaniel was just saying, more the same? It pops up every now and again. 2015, there were a number of public displays like this. Do you think that this is an escalation? And if so, why would it be happening now?
Well, I don't think there's an escalation in the levels of violence. The levels of violence have been stable during the last year. We have more or less 2,000 homicides related to organized crime every month since 1.5 years. We have like 3,000 homicides per month. That has been constant during the last 1.5 years. We have small variations per month, and also we have some changes in the geographic patterns of distribution of violence. As Nathaniel said, now we have more problems with Guanajuato, especially. Guanajuato is representing now more or less the 15% of homicides every month. That's a lot. And I think that the federal government is trying to reduce violence in Guanajuato, so the levels of national violence also decrease, and the government can have some recognition for its strategy, but that has not happened yet. No, we also have a lot of violence in Michoacán, Baja California, and Chihuahua. An alarming case is Tijuana, the border city that 2 years ago was a very peaceful place, now is the most violent city in Mexico because there's an alliance of the local cartel with Cartel de Jalisco, and they are fighting with Sinaloa for passing the drugs to California. We also have problems in Michoacán. In Michoacán, there's a problem there of chronic violence and extortion to the producers of avocado and lemons. in Chihuahua, we have also an increase of violence in Ciudad Juarez, although it has not reached the levels of 2010, 2011, when it was the most violent city in the world. Now, also, Juarez is one of the most violent cities in Mexico. So, just to summarize, I think that the changes have not been in the levels of violence, but in the increased presence of criminals organizations in social media. We have had in the last few weeks several videos of Cartel Jalisco showing its military power, its weapons, vehicles, etc., and declaring war to the federal government. I think that's really extraordinary. That has not happened in the last, I don't remember something like this, that a cartel declares war to the federal government and tries to kill some top officials of a Mexican local administration. The Secretary of Public Security in Mexico City was, by miracle, his life is was saved, but he was almost killed. And also a federal judge was killed a few weeks before that. And probably I think Cartel Jalisco is reacting to the actions of the American government, and the American government has put a lot of pressure in the Mexican government to try to disarticulate this cartel. In fact, during the first semester of this year, the arrests of top officials of Cartel Jalisco has increased in 200%. We had, just to you have an idea, during the last semester of 2019, we have an average of 10 arrests of Cartel Jalisco per month. During the first semester of this year, we have 30 arrests per month of people from Cartel Jalisco, including top officials. So I think they are reacting to this, and also to the freezing of accounts that the Mexican government and the American government had implemented during the last months.
Thank you, Eduardo. So playing off of that, Vanda, Eduardo has, as he has said, that these several unprecedented displays of force, as it were, actual or in video, a showing off of the military might, as it were. Do you find this an escalation, in your mind, is this an escalation of show, or an escalation that's just going to get worse, as perhaps is one reason Eduardo mentioned, as in reaction to the pressure that the U.S. has been putting on, and as I understand, Eduardo, a change of tactics by the Mexican government. And we will get to explore what this change of tactics means. But Vanda, the floor is yours.
Great. Good morning to everyone. I do believe that we are seeing an escalation in visibility and brazenness. And this escalation in optics has significant impact on ground realities. It's not an isolated incident. Nathaniel was speaking about what happened in Culiacan, where in the fall of last year, where one of El Chapo's sons was arrested. And the Sinaloa cartel that up till that point had acted with far greater level of restraint vis-a-vis the state than groups like the Zetas or Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, just shut up Culiacan in a way that could have been a city in a war zone. I was in Afghanistan at the time watching it and thinking that what was happening there really did not look very different in terms of the imagery than the Taliban launching a major attack on a provincial city in Afghanistan. So I think there are two sets of baselines that matter here, or three rather. One baseline is, what does this mean vis-a-vis patterns in Mexico? And I would posit that the escalation that Jalisco is engaging in now precedes really the pressure from the US, even though it may be augmented by the pressure from the US. But in June, May of last year, Jalisco shot up convoys of police vehicles and police stations without any response from the Mexican government, with the message, even if unintended, very clearly being anything goes. After Culiacan, or during the Culiacan siege of the city, the AMLO administration handed El Chapo's son over to the cartel to avoid further bloodshed, which could have been understandable as a tactical decision in that moment, but critically and enormously problematically was not followed up by any kind of response, any kind of action against Sinaloa cartel and others that act with that level of impunity. Once again, the message being sent that the cartels can literally get away with anything, not just with murder, as they have been able to get away with for many years now, but with any type of extortion. So there's been a whole chain of, for several years, of actions by Jalisco that are steadily escalating with the no doubt calculated decision to intimidate not just the state, but also rivals. But I want to go a little bit back, and this is where I think it's significant, and it's showing much larger failure of strategy in Mexico than simply the deeply inadequate and problematic security strategy of the López Obrador administration. So I think it was Eduardo who spoke about what Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez looked like in the years of 2009 through 2013, where right in the center of the city, there were attacks involving trucks with armed gunmen and mounted machine guns. That again looks like something that Al-Shabaab would use in Somalia. And eventually the markets, the criminal markets in both places settled, mostly because Sinaloa cartel and its allies were able to win in both cities. That is now off, but the consequence of that narco piece of the Sinaloa victory was that many analysts would then claim that what has changed is that the level of brazenness has gone away. And that was particularly true after the Zetas were destroyed, both from rival criminal groups and responses of the state. Well, taking away that brazenness, that sense of utter impunity, that belief that one can not just get away with murder, but with any kind of murder, would have been a very important improvement in a market, in a criminal market that is truly out of control in Mexico. And I think that what's been happening over the past really 2 years, including since October, if we take Culiacan as a baseline, but I would say going before that, say May, June of last year, the actions in Michoacan are all just revealing how that hope that at least the brazenness, that at least the level of impunity has been eliminated out of the market has been a false hope. That we are in a circumstance now where that level of impunity is even worse. So that's a second baseline I wanted to mention. And the third baseline is then to think, what does Mexico look like in comparison with other criminal markets? And Ken, one market that comes to mind is probably one that you are well familiar, which is what Colombia looked like in the latter part of the 80s, when Escobar and Los Estrelitables were trying to coerce the Colombian state into suspending extradition of traffickers to the United States and yielding in a very profound way to the wishes of major kingpins, major drug trafficking groups that ultimately gave rise to Escobar getting a very favorable deal, being able to build or refurbish his own prison from which he eventually just escaped. I mean, that to me is really comparable to what's happening now. But if you look broadly at other criminal markets, they tend to be far more peaceful. So overall in Latin America, criminal markets, drug markets are much more violent than anything that we see in East Asia and even South Asia. And across criminal markets in Africa. There are very few criminal markets in Africa that would look like the violence levels in Latin American criminal markets. And even by those standards, Mexico stands out, not necessarily in the level of homicides per 100,000, although those are important data points as well, but rather in the manner of the way that violence is perpetrated, that really takes on many trappings of a war zone. The convoy that was the Jalisco Nueva Generación convoy that was displayed was astounding. And again, if I go to war zone scenarios, the only thing that is reminiscent to me of is when the Islamic State in Iraq was taking over Iraq. The Taliban and Al-Shabaab, the Taliban in Afghanistan, Al-Shabaab in Somalia today would not dare mount this kind of visible convoy because they would be attacked with air power. And it was striking that the Mexican government did not do anything, or afterwards tried to either discredit the video and just say that it was fake, hence justification for no action, or still then to remain wedded to the hugs, not bullets, broader strategy that President López Obrador has articulated. So to me, that all speaks of a market that is enormously violent, that's caught up in a spiral of violence that's just escalating, where there are no currently deployed policy levers to change the violence and the brazenness, and where the internal criminal markets are, the internal criminal market dynamics are also such that it just perpetuates violence. There's been little coverage in the United States, outside of Mexico anyway, of a second convoy that Jalisco mounted several days after the notorious one with the tens of armored trucks that Nathaniel spoke about. And it was a much smaller convoy that Jalisco sent to attack its rivals, Los Viagras and several other groups. And although they didn't get the visibility, the timing is clearly very purposeful. The purpose of the first convoy was not just to intimidate the state, but also to intimidate the rivals. And the purpose of the second convoy then, of course, was to deliver on that threat. That said, I also don't believe that Jalisco Nueva Generación is anywhere in a position to win across Mexico and really win a bipolar war that right now is spanning from Mexico all the way to Colombia between Jalisco Nueva Generación and Sinaloa. So what it all means is that we are in likely for years yet of those devastating homicide levels that both Eduardo and Nathaniel spoke about, that no country should find tolerable.
Thank you very much, Vanda. I want to get to the issue of the government tactics, what they have been and what they might have to be going forward. But you mentioned Colombia, and it's quite a remarkable phenomenon when you see public officials in Colombia who have lived through what you just described, asking publicly what's going on in Mexico. And this is coming from Colombians who have gone through this whole process here, which is not completed, as you know. Eduardo, a war has been declared. The escalation, you talked about the escalation, it's going up. Vanda seems to think that it's here to stay for a good long while. What is your thought about that? Where is this going? A declaration of war and the idea that no place, there are no holds bar anymore. I forgot Vanda's exact expression, but basically, everything, all in love and war. It's all fair now. It's all free game, whether it's a murder in the middle of Lomas or wherever it is. What does that mean for the next several years in Mexico?
Well, it's kind of difficult to answer what the Mexican government planned to do, the federal government, because the President López Obrador just repeat the same sentence always, that he is not going to declare war to the cartels, no? And public officials of the Mexican cabinet doesn't made any public announcement of operations, etc. There's a lot of hermetism in the Mexican federal government about these issues. What is also happening now is that some governors are filling the void of the federal government in their states. The most conspicuous cases, I think, are Tamaulipas, with a governor from the Partido Acción Nacional, the PAN, who has created a special force to confront the Cartel del Noreste, that is one of the remnants of the Zetas, and has confronted them with great efficiency. In fact, homicides have been reduced in Tamaulipas. That was a very complex state, has been always very difficult state to govern and to stabilize. So this governor now has this merit. I think there's a kind of cooperation between the Texas government and the Tamaulipas government that has helped a lot to create this force and also a center of intelligence in the state. Other cases, Quintana Roo, in which there is a governor and a secretary of public security that have paid special attention to Cancun, the touristic center, and also several crimes have been reduced. But in general terms, the just created National Guard has been very absent in operations of high profile. The National Guard is being used to take care of street crime, what is kind of absurd because it's a military police, and we all thought that it was going to be created and used to confront these big militias of the cartels. I agree in what Vanda said about the increase of public appearances of the cartels, and that this has, of course, consequences on the ground. And I am convinced that now the Mexican federal government has a very special relationship with the Sinaloa cartel, and there's going to be a kind of peace between them. I mean, I don't think that the Mexican federal government will implement any operations toward that cartel if that cartel stays quiet and without generating a lot of violence. But that is very probable. It's probably the Mexican government will focus only in Jalisco cartel. And in fact, the numbers show that. I was surprised when my team showed me these figures that shows such an increase in the arrests of top members of the Jalisco cartel. What is also very surprising is that the Mexican government never announces these arrests, of these high-profile arrests, has been very quiet about that. Probably they don't want to show this to the public, so this will confirm that in fact there is a war between the Mexican government and the Jalisco cartel, and this contradicts the public narrative of the president. So I I think that violence probably will escalate gradually during the rest of the year because of this confrontation between the federal government and the Jalisco cartel.
Thank you, Eduardo. Nathaniel, there's a lot there that Vanda and Eduardo just talked about. Eduardo was saying that the state governments in a number of states have stepped up their activities. That, as I understood Eduardo's comments on the federal government, it was sort of more limited to the Jalisco cartel, if I understood that correctly.
Exactly.
Yeah. In your opening comments, Nathaniel, you thought that the hugs not bullets policy that AMLO talked about was perhaps a little bit misunderstood abroad. I think that's what you were saying. Do you want to talk a little bit about, just quickly, what that was perceived to be as a policy, and incorporating what Eduardo said about the enforcement actions that are going, maybe some would say a bit more timid than they should be, and we'll get to that. Are we seeing a change of tactics now? Is AMLO changing his tune a little bit and just not enunciating it publicly? Or is this more or less the same with a little bit of tweaks of the hugs not bullets policy?
So it's interesting because hugs not bullets is a slogan that attracts a lot of attention, both in Mexico and in foreign markets, in the U.S. in particular. But I don't think it's correct to say that it in any way reflects the López Obrador administration's policy when it comes to dealing with crime. That being said, I do think that we can say that López Obrador has a somewhat naive belief that giving people new job opportunities and fostering economic development in rural areas will automatically correspond with a decrease in organized crime. And there's something I saw was that when he was on the campaign trail before he was elected, he would make this argument again and again that Mexico needed to address the organized crime issue by dealing with social policy, by dealing with economic development initiatives. And that sounds reasonable, right? A lot of these areas that have significant problems with organized crime are areas that have a lot of poverty and a lot of inequality. But what I haven't seen is a real focus on turning that general idea into policy and complementing it with specific security policies. And this is where the rhetoric kind of breaks down. I think López Obrador makes a big attempt to differentiate himself from what he calls the failed policies of his predecessors, Enrique Peña Nieto and Felipe Calderón. But I think in broad strokes, he's repeating a lot of their failures. And particularly, he's repeating the failures of Enrique Peña Nieto in the sense that after Calderón had this whole era of, the drug war, the Mexican government is at war with cartels, Peña Nieto was elected and tried to change the narrative. And the narrative was, Mexico's now open for business. We're looking for investment. The drug war is over. That was in the past, and we're moving forward, creating a new chapter for the country. And one of the first things he did as well was create his own new national police force, the Gendarmería. And I think AMLO has really taken that exact same model and just shifted a little bit. Instead of saying, Mexico's now open for business, we're looking for foreign investment, he's saying, my Mexico will focus on social programs. My government will focus on addressing poverty in rural areas. And at the same time, he's created this national police force. But what I'm not seeing is as much attention to what's going on at the state and local level. And I think that both Peña Nieto and López Obrador thought that they could kind of get away with creating new slogans and creating a new image for Mexico, but their administrations aren't doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes to build functional police forces at the state and local level, or to address, much needed reforms in the judicial system and a critical issue of just strengthening the overall rule of law in Mexico. So the biggest question that I have right now, and something that I'm always wary about, is I think sometimes people can see these videos of these cartel caravans and imagine that all of the violence in Mexico is being perpetuated by, heavily armed military style gunmen. But in a lot of different cities and towns in Mexico, it could be that there's a group of teenagers and young men who are loosely affiliated or were previously loosely affiliated with some larger organized crime group who know how to intimidate people and use violence to achieve goals. And in a city like Acapulco right now, there's still a lot of violence in local neighborhoods. And you might see a news story about a few taxi drivers being killed. And that might remind people of what was happening in Ciudad Juarez, in the worst years of the Calderon era, when organized cartels were attacking any citizen that worked with a rival cartel. But I think now there's a real question. Are these people at the local level being killed by, cartels, international crime groups, or are they killed by, local gangs that are interested in extorting tortilla salesmen and taxi drivers and all sorts of local businesses? And that's where I think the Lopez Obrador administration has the biggest blind spot. And that's where you can say the general philosophy that they have for dealing with this problem isn't addressing those local level issues and those hyper local, smaller criminal groups.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Vanda, if in fact AMLO's policy were to have, as Nathaniel just described it, as increased social spending and to basically take away many of the preconditions that would allow or want people or drive people into the drug business, certainly it would seem the spending that or lack of spending going on with COVID and the complications going on there would certainly frustrate that end of his tactic. I was wondering if you can address his tactics in light of current circumstances, and even if those weren't the current circumstances, say the COVID didn't exist and there was still some money to spread around for social development, how still would you assess what he started off ostensibly with a policy and where he should be looking to go to now to try and address these issues?
Well, let me start by agreeing and emphasizing what Nathaniel said, that in many ways there are very strong parallels between the López Obrador administration and the Peña Nieto administration, including the evolution of an initial law enforcement gap of 2 or 3 years before either administration starts taking in a way the issue of law enforcement seriously. And even Peña Nieto had a social element policy called PRONAPET that allocated certain social packages to what was called polígonos, to the selected part of the country for addressing the root causes. Now, I have often in various settings, including during the Calderon administration, strongly advocated that a law enforcement strategy alone were insufficient, and that as long as people had closer bonds with the criminal groups because they provided them with employment or security, simply law enforcement strategy alone were insufficient. But what the López Obrador administration has ended up doing is to throw the baby away with the bathwater. It is equally inappropriate and fantastical to believe that a socioeconomic strategy alone, in the absence of meaningful law enforcement, can be either effectively mounted or address all causes. So the long-term economic development that focuses on young, vulnerable people in Mexico that AMLO wants to focus on is a strategy of 2 or 3 decades to start, under best circumstances, at least a decade, to start drying out the pool of potential recruits. I mean, anything is significant about the extraordinarily criminal market out of control criminal market in Mexico is also how the criminal groups treat local allies, local groups, and their essential view of open-ended law enforcement. So the men that were sent to assassinate Secretary of Public Security in DF, Garcia Harfuch, were sent as totally expendable body, as cannon fodder. There was essentially no chance that they would get away from the failed attack. And that takes place in many hits in Mexico. Simply, there is no sense that recruitment is difficult, which is significant for how extraordinarily challenging a policy that tries to turn down violence by drying up the pool of potential recruits is. Second, the AMLO administration, and this goes back to our conversation of how policy has evolved or not, really disavowed going after the criminal groups. And the law enforcement strategy that it started articulating that at one point included versions of an amnesty for criminals that could have been even extended in some formulations to criminal groups, not just low-level criminals to whom it ended up being applied, were really one on non-confrontation. The National Guard, as it was created and were to be deployed to these 290-some, 283 parts of Mexico that were quite strikingly similar in its conceptualization to the polygonous approach of the EPN administration, really had never any kind of articulated mandate or strategy of how to deliver security, what delivering security on the ground meant. And they were specifically not to go after the big criminal groups and not to confront them. That, however, started changing after the attack on the Lobaron family and US policy actions. And it was really the threat of the Trump administration to unleash a wide spectrum of sanctions on Mexico, and particularly the threat of designating Mexican cartels as terrorist groups, including repeated visit of the Trump administration officials such as Attorney General Barr, that starting in February of this year pushed the AMLO administration to limited high-value targeting, which is exactly what EPN ended up doing, even though he disavowed it after Calderon. Now, the high-value targeting comes in with many problems. It perpetuates the fragmentation of the criminal market, and with its the many loose actors that Nathaniel spoke about that are in the market, that just complicates the intelligent picture, the balance of power, ability, the ability to establish balances of power, the ability to establish reliable alliances, all the more challenging. So to me, it's a very problematic strategy. That said, however, it's equal mistake to say that any and all response against the cartels and actions like Culiacan, like the convoy, like attack on Garcia Harfuch equals high value targeting. So once again, policy oscillates between two unwise extremes. Just to do nothing is enormously problematic. I spoke about the sense of brazenness and the way the big cartels are emboldened. But the lack of actions against the big cartels equally terribly emboldens, extremely problematically emboldens the small criminal groups in Mexico, those that extort taxi drivers in Acapulco and have been for many years. It even extorts, it even emboldens just about anyone to set up their own extortion racket against neighbors or local businesses and say, we are the cartel of X, Y, and Z. Just appropriate the label or make up some criminal group label, even if it is not underpinned by actual firepower, because the pervasive sense is one of impunity and fear. And that just allows not the big cartels to get away with murder, it allows everyone else to get away with crime. And so this situation is enormously destructive of the very functioning of society. Now, overlay it with COVID, which has two impacts, of course. One, it significantly weakens all kinds of capacities of the Mexican government. And it, of course, destroys the legal Mexican economy, where the expectation is that the economy might shrink by between 5 and 8%, perhaps even more, 8%, which is awful for any country in any circumstances. That also means much less capacity to deliver aid. AMLO has bizarrely chosen to give minimal bailout packages to the economy. The level of support is nowhere comparable to what other countries in Latin America have mounted, or what the United States have mounted in terms of proportions. I'm not talking about the absolute numbers. And so that means is that the whole policy of drying up the recruitment base by addressing the long-term underlying socioeconomic deficiencies in Mexico is not going to be addressed, and it's going to be the criminal groups more than ever that in the immediate years will be the sources of not just handouts like we have seen all cartels handing out food, petty money, and sanitizer packages, but they will be the sources of direct or indirect employment.
Thank you, Vanda. Eduardo, I saw you, I think, writing furiously on all the comments that Vanda was making. And she made a number of extraordinary points. The floor is yours to address any and all of the things that she talked about.
Yes, of course. No, not at all. I respect and admire Vanda's work. It's really interesting how she compares what is happening in Mexico with other countries in Asia, including Africa. It's really impressive. No, what I would like to say is three or 4 points. First one, I think that's really surprising for Mexicans to see a leftist government like AMLO's so without social intelligence to plan its attacks or operations to confront crime. I always thought before AMLO was going to be president that if he was going to be president, he was going to be a very well-informed president in the sense that he, with the implementation of so many social programs, he will have people on ground to report to the intelligence centers what is happening in these places where violence is so high. And he was going also to be very clear about the identity of criminals to go and arrest them. And I don't see that at all. I think that our intelligence apparatus has been deteriorated, and I think that simply that these operations are being implemented without good intelligence, and that was evident in the operation in Sinaloa with capture of video that was frustrated later. No, and I think that that really worries me, because without intelligence, it's going to be very difficult really to weaken these cartels. That's my first point. The second point is about something that Nathaniel said. He said that there's no relationship between this narrative of more hawks and reality. I think that there's a relationship, a very important one, that has to do with the levels of lethality that now we have in the confrontations between the armed forces and the crime groups. For the first time, these lethality levels have decreased, and the relationship between civilians murdered and civilians injured have inverted. Now we have more injured than civilians killed, and during the Peña administration and Calderón administration, always we have almost all the civilians killed in these operations, and that have changed a lot. And I think that is an important point that probably will be recognized to this government later. but I think that there is some truth in this narrative. It's not only a fantastic narrative, but it has clear relationship with how the military now is operating on the ground. My third point has to do with what Vanda said about social policy as a security strategy. I think that during the first year, this was true. The president really thought that his social programs will reduce violence. But in December, last December, the Secretary of Security said that they were going to change that strategy. And that now the axis of the strategy was going to be fight corruption, because all these mafias that we have in Mexico, around 300 mafias, local mafias, are related to the profound corruption and complicity between criminals and authorities. And during this first semester, I think that the Mexican government has concentrated in a work of financial intelligence to freeze accounts, to seize several states of not only cartels, but also of corrupt public officials. And that, I think that was an important change, because give to the strategy, I think, more clarity in some way. No? The third point has to do with the complexity that the scenario is in the near future. We have now a problem of increased high-profile violence in Mexico because of the confrontation between Jalisco cartel and the federal government. And I think we will have probably during the last months of this year problems of social conflictivity because of the unemployment, the high rates of unemployment we are now registering. And also we have elections, intermediate elections next year. I think also that the Jalisco cartel will be very active to try to be some of its members be candidates to some political posts at the local level, mayors, legislative posts, etc. And probably we will have also a scenario in some states like Guerrero, Michoacán, Veracruz, Chihuahua, episodes of political violence. And this really makes things much more complex because we will not only have a problem of criminal violence, but also a problem of governance, of governability in several regions. And I don't see how the federal government will confront this situation, this really complex scenario.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Though it's sort of related to that, and Eduardo, if you want to answer, or anybody else, we have a question. And for those who have submitted questions, please know that I'm trying to weave them in to the conversation as possible. We may not get to all of them, but I think some of them have been answered indirectly without me having to ask them. But there is one question here. It says, can the recent transfer of ports in the Marine Customs Control to the Navy and the Army provide to be an effective policy going forward with respect to mitigating the high degree of drug trafficking and gun trafficking? Does anybody want to take that question? Eduardo, go ahead. Yeah, and then Vanda, go, and then I'll come to Eduardo. Go ahead, Vanda.
Sure. Look, the quality of security in ports in Mexico, as well as land crossings, but particularly ports, has been very low. And part of that is that the existing customs body really focuses on collecting revenues, which is a very important task for a force, but does not really think of border security in the way that United States, for example, thinks of border security. And so many of the port authorities lack capacity for meaningful anti-crime actions, and they often are under tremendous pressures from criminal groups, with ports such as Lázaro Cárdenas being notorious for the level of influence that criminal groups have over that port. So certainly strengthening and beefing up that capacity is very important. The question is whether Sedona and Semar, the Marines and the land forces, the land armed forces, are the optimal body for doing that. And that goes back to complex questions. One of the things that is very interesting about AMLO, Eduardo spoke about how he had expectations of AMLO having very good local ground knowledge. I think many were expected AMLO to have a very distant relationship with the armed forces. Instead, certainly Sedona, the land forces have been a very close ally of AMLO, and AMLO is reaching out over to them in very many ways. The issue of the ports is not unique. The AMLO administration has also decided to hand over the enforcement of fisheries to Semar. So this trend to militarize all manner of institutions in Mexico is deeply underway. So my broad point here is that cleaning the ports, not just for better tax revenue, but for less contraband flowing through, and for much better intelligence, and really severing the hold that many criminal groups have over port and land authorities, land crossing authorities, is critical. But I'm not persuaded that Semar or Sedona are the optimal agency to handle this. And anyway, it's just reflective of this broad, decades-long pattern in Mexico that as institutions are failing and police reform is inadequate, the solution constantly is to hand over all manner of domestic enforcement to the military. And this way precedes Calderon and really goes back to the 1980s, late 1980s, and continues to be a steady trend. Devastatingly, in my view, the competence that has been built up in the federal police in Mexico under Calderon and with US assistance and under Peña has really been destroyed, or at least very significantly weakened by the AMLO administration taking the federal police and tearing up units to fold them into the National Guard. So not only has the López Obrador administration dropped the ball on police reform, as Nathaniel said, I would say that's even bleaker than that, that whatever accomplishments that have been, at least with the federal police, if not municipal police, has been significantly compromised.
Thank you, Vanda. I'm aware of the time, and I know that we've been going for about an hour, and it's past noon time on the East Coast, the lunchtime. But I did want to ask Nathaniel a bit about what any effect he thinks this is having on foreign investors or even local investment in Mexico. I know you spend a lot of time, Nathaniel, talking to them, but and I will end on that, but I just want to go back to Eduardo before we finish and go to you, Nathaniel. Eduardo, did you have any comments on the use of the armed forces in the customs and the interdiction, or in the basically running customs? Yeah, okay.
Vanda comment was enough.
Okay, so Nathaniel, let's finish on this note. You spend a lot of time talking to investors in Mexico. Do you find that this is sending a chill through them, or are they taking this more in stride, maybe beefing up or not their security measures, but not deterred in their belief in the future of Mexico and the opportunities in Mexico for them? You're on mute, Nathaniel, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I think that executives at multinational companies that have significant operations in Mexico, or the directors of funds that are making significant investments in Mexico or in other countries in the region, already understand two fundamental things about Mexico. And they are that Mexico is a country with limited state capacity and weak rule of law. So anybody who's thinking about investing in a project in Mexico or buying a company in Mexico will, I think, understand that concept. And I think that most foreign executives or investors who are thinking about making significant investments understand that significant levels of organized crime activity or violence are part of the operating environment in Mexico. And I think that in particular for manufacturing companies, industrial companies, there's a pretty clear sense that they will be able to liaise directly with the state government or with the federal government and be able to implement security measures around their own facility and protect their workers. And they might know these groups, these caravans of gunmen aren't likely to try to extort executives at a foreign manufacturing company. And so in general, these companies might try to take measures to protect their workers, maybe hire their own vans to bring workers in and out of the factory, put security fencing around the entire facility. But those are pretty standard security measures that aren't necessarily different from measures they might take in other countries around the world. I think that there's two things. One, this could, the long-term dynamic and these current events could be more problematic for companies that operate in rural areas, and particularly perhaps for mining companies, telecom companies, energy companies, any company that's looking at doing its first project in a state like Chihuahua or in Guanajuato or anywhere that will require sending workers into rural areas where the federal government has a very limited presence. Sure, the current dynamic right now needs to be understood. And more importantly than that, the local dynamic needs to be understood. And maybe the thing that I'll end on is I think that foreign investors in general can figure out what risks they'll face at the local level and what they need to do to operate in that environment. And if somebody sees a high value opportunity, they'll figure out how to make it work. But what I'm more worried about is local investment, especially if wealthy Mexicans are moving money overseas versus investing in Mexico, or just people at the local level. If people are thinking they could open a restaurant or build an ecotourism business in their own town and put money that they're earning from, an avocado growing business or a cattle growing business into a new legal business at the local level, weak rule of law and security problems at the local level might discourage that type of investment. And in general, I think that's a big issue in Mexico. We can kind of calculate how much money do businesses in Mexico waste on excessive security measures, but we'll never be able to calculate how much investment Mexico is losing out on at the local level, because people prefer just to move their money outside of their own town and not invest in businesses in their own community.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. We've gone over an hour, and I know all our panelists have very busy agenda. So I am going to make an executive decision to close the event now. Thank you, Vanda, Eduardo, and Nathaniel. Thank you, Marta, for all your work in engineering this event. As we always say, this is not the last time we're going to touch this subject. And everything that we heard today would indicate that it should be something that should be continued to be discussed and discussed openly. So thank you very much, panelists. Thank you for all of those who have listened. The video of this event ought to be posted tonight, tomorrow morning at the latest at our website at ccacanada.com. So I invite you to listen to that or send it to others who you think would be interested, who haven't been able to attend live in person with us today. With that, thank you very much. Have a good afternoon to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.